3500 BC. The small island, eventually to be known as Cuba, was met with its first inhabitants, the Taoni and Cubani natives, though the Cubani eventually perished, while the Taoni thrived due to their innovations in utilizing the yucca fruit and other native plant species for agriculture. 1492, on his first Spanish-sponsored voyage to the soon-to-be Americas, while sailing south of the Bahamas, Christopher Columbus stumbled across the congenial island of Cuba. Within 2 years, the Spanish quickly began to conquer, colonize, and convert the areas around Cuba. Then, in 1415, Diego Velázquez conquers Cuba on behalf of Spain and establishes its first 7 settlements. The existing Taino population dared to resist the Spanish incursions, though were only met with devastation, as they were easily slaughtered. Within 3 years, the Spanish had conquered the Taino and gained dominion over Cuba, along with the enterprise of Taino and other Indian slaves. 1542, Indian slavery was abolished due to their greater quantity of African slaves storming the markets. Thus, this was the beginning of the Spanish importations of African slaves, which in turn introduced Cuba to its first ethnic African. The Spanish were quick to see to the establishment of plantations in order to harvest citrus, sugar, and tobacco from the rich Cuban soils. Cuba then proceeded to be one of the greatest mass producers of produce such as tobacco and sugar, and as a result of Spain's ownership over Cuba, Spain had a complete monopoly over these resources. When the 7-Year War came around in 1754, the British, being an enemy of the French, which were allies of the Spanish, eventually launched an attack to capture Cuba, along with its abundance of resources. The British were quick to capture Havana and with that the entire western portion of Cuba. After gaining control of Cuba's many resources, the British ensured to increase the production of the many Cuban plantations. In order to do this, they imported hundreds of additional African slaves. After 11 months, the British occupation came to an end due to the Peace of Paris Treaty being administered. With this, the British persuaded the French to trade Florida and the Spaniards to trade Mexico in order to regain control of Cuba. 1817, Spain's tobacco monopoly ceases to exist as the public organization Factoria, which sells Cuban tobacco at fixed prices abroad, is abolished due to the King of Spain, Ferdinand VII, decides that tobacco should be privatized and owned solely by himself, which results in private sale of tobacco to the highest bidder, allowing any wealthy country to obtain great quantities of tobacco, thus relieving Spain of their monopoly of the great resource. In 1820, due to the increased slave counts and industrial innovations, Cuba becomes the greatest sugar producer in the world, along with having the worst working conditions for their laborers. This goes on for a while, that is, until 1868, whereas the Cuban slaves can no longer be docile to the Spanish rule, which eventually escalates into a war of independence. At this point in Cuba history, most of the population consists of African slaves, the rest are Spaniards that owned them. This war lasted 10 years. Eventually, the war ends because of Cuba's dwindling resources of manpower and weaponry. The Cuban government accepts Spanish peace terms. Due to this result, Spain retains significant control over Cuba and perpetuates its slavery. During this period of forced peace, Jose Marti funds the Cuban Revolutionary Party, which is actually pretty difficult because he had to unify many traditionally conflicting interests behind the goal of Cuban independence. 1895, another war of independence, the Marti Uprising begins! Then, during this war, the US decides to intervene as they were very angry over losing one of their warships as it was sailing their east coasts. As a result, the Treaty of Peace in Paris ends. Seeing that Cuba was in the midst of fighting Spain, the US in 1898 decided to join in, thus the war became the Spanish-Cuban-American War. After beating up the Spaniards, the US and Spain signed a peace treaty which grants the US control over 4 new territories: Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. Although the treaty officially grants Cuba independence, the US flag, not the Cuban flag, is raised over Havana, and Cuban representatives were not allowed at the signing. The Second Cuban War for Independence was over, though their tyranny of ownership was merely exchanged. Due to the US now having sovereignty over Cuba, the Cubans then adopted Western-style political leadership, along with cultural values, also republicizing many of their resources. With this, Thomas Estrada Paloma then becomes Cuba's first president in 1902. to Cuban Independence Day, the Cubans were quick to revolt against him because he gained presidency due to the U.S.'s influence, and as such, Thomas Estrada Palma lost his presidency in 1906. As a result of this revolt being successful, U.S. soldiers were sent to reoccupy Cuba. After gaining control over Cuba once again, the U.S. employs an American lawyer, Charles Edward Magoon, to become Cuba's governor. Following this forced political influence, the U.S. constructs a naval base on the coast of Cuba. Due to the U.S.'s economic involvement, Cuba's national growth was weakened, and the island was made more dependent on its northern neighbor. Gerardo Mercado y Morales, a man elected president on May 20th, 1925, soon becomes hated by the Cubans. Due to him, against their own constitution, forces to be re-elected and begins privatizing all their resources, which in turn lowered the wages of the labor class. As a result of this, in 1933, President Gerardo Mercado y Morales is overthrown in a coup d'etat led by student and intellectuals following great hardships endured during the Great Depression. Following this, Fulgencio Batista seizes power due to the support of the U.S. With this, Cuba's resources were in control of Batista, which ensured that they were sold to the U.S. at considerably good prices. Because of this, Cuba's government soon became more authoritative and privatized, and the general Cuban public were in poverty once again. 1955, Fulgencio Batista is overthrown by another coup d'etat led by Fidel Castro. Castro, whom as a young man who hated the U.S. while bearing Marxist-Leninist ideologies, created a centralized communist state within Cuba, which in turn republicized their resources once again. The U.S. did not like Fidel Castro. In 1961, the tension was high. The Soviets and the United States were under mutually ensured destruction if any one was ever so inclined to harm the other. Cuba converting to communism was a clear sign of Soviet alliance. As a response to this, the CIA employed an invasion to siege Cuban power, an affair known as the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs was characterized by the CIA hiring Cuban exiles to siege power from the Castro reign. It was a failure. 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Following Cuba's declared socialist policies following the Bay of Pigs, the Soviet Union tried to put nuclear missiles on the island. This event was the closest the Cold War came to becoming World War III. Though these missiles were never stationed in Cuba, as a US-Soviet agreement ended the Cuban Missile Crisis, which assured Cuba's protection from military actions administered by the United States. Due to the Cuban-Soviet alliance, Fidel Castro was well protected from US interventions, and with this protection came access to the international scene. Though this ended in the collapse of Soviet communism in the early 1990s, destroying Cuba's economy. Without the support of the Soviets, the Cubans had no means of international trade or protection. As the post-Soviet Cuban economy imploded for lack of once generous Soviet subsidies, illegal immigration to the US became a growing phenomenon. The 1994 Batzero crisis, named after the makeshift rafts or other unworthy vessels used by thousands of Cubans, constituted the largest wave of Cuban illegal immigrant migration, resulting in 125,000 leaving the island. A Cuban-US agreement was created in order to limit illegal immigration, but had the unintended effect of making alien smuggling of Cubans into the United States a major business. In 2006, Fidel Castro underwent surgery for intestinal bleeding, but before he undergone surgery, he delegated his presidential duties to Raul Castro, his brother. Fidel Castro survived surgery, though because of his poor physical condition, preferred that his brother remained president. This was widely accepted in Cuba, as the National Assembly of People's Power on February 24th, 2008 anonymously voted Raul Castro to be president. 2015, US President Barack Obama and Cuban President Raul Castro agreed that the United States and Cuba would end more than a half-century of enmity and start normalizing relations. And that concludes Cuba's history hitherto.